Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on your time zone. And welcome to today's webinar, Pandemic Health Legislation and Policy Around the World. This is the second in a series of webinars sponsored by the International Conference on Legislation and Law Reform in anticipation of our seventh conference, which will be held in Washington, D.C. this October. My name is Matt McGee. In addition to my full-time job of drafting legislation for the United States Senate, I am part of a group of attorneys who volunteer their time to organize the conference. Details about the conference can be found on our website, www.ilegis.org. I'm so glad that you and many others around the world chose to spend this time with us, virtually of course, to learn more about how legislatures around the world have responded to a pandemic that has dramatically affected each of our lives. We are especially grateful for the willingness of our esteemed panelists to share their perspectives on this topic. Before we begin, I would like to thank the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School for hosting this webinar, particularly events coordinator Neoshi Giles. I would also like to recognize Kathy Pagano and Larry Shapiro, two of our conference organizers, for organizing this event. I would also like to acknowledge our sponsors, the Federal Bar Association, a founding conference sponsor which has been supporting the professional development of attorneys involved in federal law for more than a century. Essential Legislative Technologies, a longtime conference sponsor which helps legislatures transform the drafting, amending, publishing, and codification of legislation, regulations, and other critical government documents into a state-of-the-art web-enabled software platform. And finally, the State Bar of Texas, a first-time conference sponsor whose mission is to support the administration of the legal system, provide its citizens with equal access to justice, foster high standards of ethical conduct for lawyers, and educate the public about the rule of law. Today's moderator will be Warren Burke, who is one of the founders of the International Conference on Legislation and Law Reform, and a legislative drafter in the United States with more than 2 decades experience. Warren will now provide a brief overview of the history of the conference and then introduce today's panelists.
Thank you, Matt. And I should say that Matt is also one of the founding volunteers of the International Conference on Legislation and Law Reform. We began this event back in 2013, and it's really how it's grown. The general focus of the conference is on how laws are written around the world at the international, national, and subnational levels. And really what it's all about is bringing together a wide array of experts to discuss and share their perspectives on a topic of really great importance, namely the drafting and reform of laws. We were at the World Bank for several years, but have now shifted to the DC Bar headquarters building. This year's conference will be held on October 21st and 22nd, and circumstances permitting, we will be holding it in person. That's certainly what we're hoping for, but we will also be live streaming for the first time. As Matt mentioned, the conference website is www.ilegis.org, I-L-E-G-I-S, and I encourage you to check it out. Now for some technical details. The plan is for the 3 panelists and I to begin with a conversation among the 4 of us for about 50 minutes. And then we'll follow that with a Q&A session. You can submit questions at any point. However, I will not be relaying audience questions. The panelists will not be taking them until the Q&A session at the end. The way that you submit questions is to go to the Q&A feature on the ribbon at the bottom of the window on your screen, not the chat, but the Q&A feature. And I would ask you please to keep your comments topical and appropriate. We, the organizers, reserve the right to remove from this webinar anyone who posts inappropriate language or content. One other thing which I should point out is that this webinar is being recorded. So now let's dive into what we're all here for today and eager to talk about, namely pandemic health legislation and policy around the world, we have assembled a distinguished cast of 3 expert panelists, the first of whom is Kashish Aneja. Kashish is a practicing advocate in New Delhi, where he specializes in global public health law. Kashish is also a legal consultant for the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He is also the co-founder of the Society for Democratic Rights. Interestingly, one thing he's doing there is leading the COVID-19 Law Lab collaboration, which involves gathering and analyzing COVID-19 laws and policies from across South Asia and Southeast Asia. Our second panelist is Matthew Kavanagh. He is an assistant professor of global health and a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He is also the director of the Global Health Policy and Politics Initiative at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law. Our third panelist will be Michele Forzley. Michele is the director of Forzley and Associates. Michele does projects all around the world, specializing in regulatory systems strengthening and governance in the health and pharmaceutical sectors. She is also an adjunct professor teaching public health law at New England Law, Boston. So without further ado, let's jump right in. And Kashish, I would like to turn to you, if I could, for the first question. And that is, why is there a need, do you think, for comprehensive legislation for an effective public health response to a pandemic? And does this particular pandemic reinforce that need in some way?
Thanks, Warren, and hi, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking iLegis and UPenn for organizing this extremely timely conversation. In India, we are unfortunately in the midst of the second wave of this pandemic, and I'm sure by now all of you must be aware of the crisis we are in, with 295,000 cases reported today and over 2,000 deaths. This just reinforces the importance of this event. Before I start addressing Warren's question, I'd like to highlight a general caveat that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to this pandemic. Each country has its own unique dynamics. I know our audience today, especially from India, is yearning for answers. However, at the same time, there are certain fundamentals which are key to a pandemic response, and I think today we are here to address these fundamentals. It's also important to be acutely conscious that law, while it plays an important role, it might not have every answer. And any legal reform should proceed side by side with greater political will and greater public investment in healthcare to boost capacity and infrastructure. So, on why is there a need for an appropriate legislation for an effective public health response to a pandemic, there are two big arguments to this why. The first argument is rooted in the principles of civil liberties. The second argument is rooted more in the regulatory function of law. An advantage of having this conversation today, as opposed to when the pandemic had just begun, is that we have witnessed examples from world over as to what happens when there is lack of appropriate legislation for a public health emergency response. Now, as far as civil liberties is concerned, an important function of law is to uphold democratic values while meeting its regulatory function. These principles include transparency, accountability, legitimacy, proportional actions, which are important even during a pandemic. This pandemic has witnessed many of these violations, and in many instances, the reasons can be traced to inappropriate legislations. For instance, during this pandemic, numerous governments have faced charges of exploiting public health and disinformation concerns to stifle free speech and protests. In Malaysia, an 8-month state of national emergency was approved in January, and the authorities just earlier this month introduced longer prison sentences for people accused of spreading pandemic disinformation, sparking concerns that such powers could be used to quash legitimate dissent. In Hong Kong, critics have accused authorities of using the pandemic as a pretext to postpone elections and arrest anti-government protesters. Hundreds have been arrested in Cambodia, India, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia on the grounds of spreading pandemic-related misinformation. While in some countries, authorities have been criticized for using the pandemic to tackle issues not related to the public health at all. For example, in Singapore, the government planned to use its contact tracing app for criminal investigations by police for purposes beyond COVID-19, despite earlier assurances that it would only be used to track the virus. This is a classic instance of what we call function creep. In Australia, the Premier of Western Australia flagged extending state border controls beyond the pandemic to tackle drug smuggling before doing a U-turn in the face of criticism. Other pandemic measures have been condemned as excessively harsh, including Britain's introduction of prison terms of up to 10 years for people who lie about their travel history, which is clearly completely disproportionate. So these are just some examples of civil liberty concerns that have arisen in this pandemic, and laws play a critical role in protecting these civil liberties and fundamental freedoms of citizens. During a pandemic, what is at stake is not only freedoms, but also accountability and the rule of law. It's been more than a year into the global crisis, and governments still continue to enforce lockdowns and other restrictions in response to COVID-19, and often unjustifiably. Now, the normalization of extraordinary pandemic regulations raises concerns about how readily authorities may embrace illiberal responses to future crises. Let's take Philippines, for example. Philippines has one of the world's longest and strictest lockdowns. Undoubtedly, lockdowns have prevented Philippines hospitals from being overwhelmed, but they also constitute what the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights described as a highly militarized response to the pandemic. Appropriate public health emergency laws help us in keeping exactly such powers in check. This pandemic has stressed the importance of authorities to clearly communicate the need and rationale for extraordinary measures, and we need laws to ensure exactly this. Look at South Korea, for example. They've implemented a sophisticated digital contact tracing system way back in 2015 during the outbreak of MERS, and they used an exactly similar technology quite successfully for the present pandemic response. Now, although this raises numerous concerns of privacy violations, their data protection laws prohibit the misuse of data that is collected. Now, while measures such as digital contact tracing and national lockdowns may be the right advancements by a sensible government, a renegade government may abuse some of these privileges as well. And therefore, the checks and balances always need to be there. And that's precisely why we need appropriate legislations during a public health crisis. Now, for the second why of pandemic legislations, that's a bit more obvious. It's the regulatory function. Regulations should clearly define the roles and functions of governments, authorities, and those in power during a pandemic. This helps maintain consistency and ensure certainty. It helps in taking precautionary decisions as opposed to only reactive ones. In an unregulated space, physical, intellectual, or even financial muscle often enables stronger elements to claim a disproportionately large territory of activity and influence, which might divert attention from the actual pandemic response, and as a result, worsen the public health crisis. Much of what is happening in India right now as we speak, unfortunately, can be attributed to this. And hence, effective legal framework goes towards ensuring that public health emergency preparedness and response plans stand independent of political and economic fluctuations.
Thank you, Kashish. That was a terrific explanation of why there is a need for comprehensive legislation, and also I think how high the stakes can be here. It makes me think of a second question, which is, well, I should say in my free time, I like to do some cooking, and always the first thing I look at when I turn to a new recipe is the list of ingredients. And so what I'm wondering is, what are the ingredients that you see as being necessary in this sort of comprehensive legislation dealing with pandemic response on the national level? And also, can you give us some examples of different countries that have enacted legislation, in response to the pandemic?
Thanks, Glenn. This is an interesting question because over the past 1 year, we have seen several kinds of legislations that countries have relied upon during this pandemic response. I like to list out the key ingredients in any legal response to a pandemic in 3 categories. The first one are the public health regulatory components. The second is the checks and the balances. And I've already explained the reasons of why we need both these elements. And the third one is privacy concern. And I'll explain you later why I have categorized this quite separately. As far as the public health regulatory components are concerned, there are some basic essential components that by now I'm sure all of us have heard of. These include lockdowns, curfews, regulating individual movements, mask mandates, border restrictions, both international as well as domestic borders, quarantine and isolation measures, surveillance, including contact tracing. Now, the laws, to the extent possible, should provide for these components, which are required in response to a pandemic. And they must also clearly mention the penalties for the violation of these offenses. But as I mentioned at the very start, not everything can and should be governed by law, particularly during emergencies. A degree of flexibility is required to take spontaneous actions, and for that, we should avoid over-regulation. Another component is that national laws and emergency plans must take into account international obligations, which includes our International Health Regulation, IHR, which is a legally binding WHO regulation. Next, public health agency laws should clearly define legal authority and the roles of key officials during an emergency. Overlapping authority and gaps in authority may cause uncertainty, disputes, lack of coordination between different levels and departments of governments at the time of the pandemic response. Hence, a public health law should clearly delineate the powers and functions of different ministries, as well as the statutory and executive bodies. Then public health law should establish clear triggers for the application of emergency powers. They should define and categorize public health emergencies, as well as set clear time limits for the application of these emergency powers. This is so important even in the present day context. So just ask yourself, what is the threshold to resume normal life and renew civil liberties? Who decides this and when? There's a legitimate risk that in this pandemic, many governments would avoid the question of what level of virus prevalence would be anticipated for returning to normality in the likely scenario COVID-19 was never fully eliminated. Hence the importance that the law should mention clear triggers and the clear time limit of the emergency powers. Then, to increase the health workforce during an emergency, public health laws may grant temporary practice licenses to health professionals who are inactive, retired, or licensed in other jurisdictions. Laws may also authorize government authorities to take control of premises, facilities and supplies, including health facilities, medical supplies, and provided that reasonable compensation is paid. And finally, laws should also authorize public health officials to purchase and acquire essential medicines, vaccines, and other medical supplies from public or private sources on reasonable terms. Next, moving on to the checks and balances which every public health emergency law should reflect. So laws should have clear provisions to ensure that health powers are exercised in a transparent and non-discriminatory manner, with full respect for the dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of persons, and should not be arbitrary. Emergency laws that place limitations on individual freedoms during a public health emergency must, first, they should respond to a pressing public health or a social need. They should pursue a specified and legitimate aim. They should be proportional to the legitimate aim. And finally, they should not be any more restrictive than required to achieve the purpose sought by restricting the right. Now, this means that the measures adopted during an emergency must be least invasive and intrusive to civil liberties. For instance, in case of restricting international travels, only those health measures be adopted that are neither more restrictive of international traffic and nor more intrusive to persons than reasonable and appropriate international measures. Now, many of you lawmakers and policymakers, right in the beginning of last year, that's March, must have read that many of the international travel restrictions violated Article 43 of the IHR. This is exactly what I'm talking about here. So in a sense, there are two important tools to ensure that these checks and balances find place in a public health emergency law. The first is that laws should include accountability mechanisms, such as the right to seek review of decisions that affect a person's fundamental rights by an independent external body within a time frame that is reasonable in the circumstances. It is important to keep in mind that often during a pandemic, national courts may become inoperational for some time, and that even happened in India. Another tool to ensure transparency is to have a mandatory requirement in law for the executive to pass written orders and publish them in public. And this will ensure that they can be challenged in court, because at the end of the day, transparency is often conceived as the principal safeguard for accountability. Moving on to my third category of the ingredients, which are the privacy concerns. And so this pandemic has witnessed excessive use of technology for public health surveillance in the form of contact tracing. While this is definitely going the right direction, it raises numerous privacy concerns that must be addressed in laws. Certain principles that every data privacy law, as well as laws governing public health surveillance, must respect include purpose limitation, which basically means that a reasonable nexus should exist between the object sought to be achieved and the means to achieve them. Then storage limitation, that implies that time-bound retention and proper destruction or deletion of data should be done once the purpose has been met. Then data minimization, which reflects that minimal amount of data should be collected and only what is necessary to achieve the limited objective. And finally, transparency and accountability measures, which includes having full public disclosures and having an independent regulatory authority that oversees every executive action. So some important privacy legislative examples are, and one of my almost favorite, comes from Europe, and that's the EU GDPR, which is the overarching privacy law in EU. It acts as a guiding star on this issue. Back in March last year, the regulatory authority had issued clear guidelines for countries to respect privacy rights while engaging in contact tracing through technology. We have other decent privacy law examples coming from California and South Korea. As far as India is concerned, it's unfortunate we are struggling to pass a data protection law for the past 2 years, and it's only a need of the hour. So just to reflect on some important legislations and examples of legislation as far as the pandemic response is concerned, I'll first talk about India quickly and then come to Thailand. So in India, the laws that were employed in the ongoing crisis are the Epidemic Disease Act of 1897 and the Disaster Management Act of 2005. Unfortunately, neither of these constitute an effective legal framework for public health emergency preparedness and response in India. The Epidemic Disease Act, which is a century-old colonial legislation, comprises of just 4 sections and doesn't even define epidemic or communicable diseases. In fact, there are no definitions in the laws at all, and it fails to lay down clear roles and duties of authorities. It is also clear from the scheme of the Disaster Management Act that it contemplates natural and man-made disasters and does not deal with outbreaks or public health emergencies. So hence the use of such ad hoc legal architecture in India with a multiplicity of statutes has resulted in a patchwork response against the epidemics. Looking at Thailand, they have a Communicable Disease Act of 2015, which is a pretty decent legislation. They have clear definitions. They have categories for communicable diseases based on severity. They lay down roles and functions of different authorities during a pandemic. In fact, they even have a provision for maintaining confidentiality and for processing data on an anonymous basis. Provisions for quarantine and isolation, as well as disease surveillance and restricting individuals, also find place in Thailand. I'm not saying they have the best legislation, but it's a good and decent law. Other interesting examples comes from Indonesia, which has a threefold legal response to the pandemic, which in the form of the Law on Infectious Diseases 1984, the Law on Disaster Management 2007, Law on Home Quarantine 2018. South Korea also has 2 decent laws. One is the Infectious Disease Control and Prevention Act, and the other is the Quarantine Act 2009. So for those of you who are interested to dig into different kinds of legislations countries across the world have relied on during the pandemic, I would highly recommend to look at the COVID-19 Law Lab, which is an open access tool developed by WHO, the O'Neill Institute for National Global Health Law, UNDP, and other partners. The lab covers laws and policies across the world, categorized into 7 responses. I'll be glad to share the link in the chat box for our audience. And finally, another key ingredient in any legal response to a pandemic should be having the right decision makers. There is such a greater need to have global health and public health lawyers at the forefront. We need to lay down the groundwork for cross-disciplinary brainstorming to resolve such complex issues. Thanks, Warren.
Thank you, Kashish. That was a really fantastic, impressive checklist for the sorts of things a country needs written into its law in order to effectively address a public health emergency. I know that sometimes you will find those elements in, say, a model law, but of course, as you point out, countries are not starting from scratch here. Like you mentioned, for India, we have laws going all the way back into the 1800s. You start with a legal framework, and so I can see how in that context, going through a checklist can be extremely useful for purposes of building upon the laws that you have in place and those which you need in place. At this point, what I would like to do, if I could, is turn to Matt, keep on the theme of the pandemic, but maybe drill into the specifics a little bit more. And specifically, I'm wondering, Matt, about how the international rules for distributing essential goods, obviously vaccines being one, how are those rules working?
Thanks, Warren, and thanks to all the organizers for having me. And what a great conversation so far. Look, the science on COVID-19 has been truly remarkable, right? We can look, for example, at February 4th in the United States. 5,000 people died of COVID in the US February 4th. Yesterday, about 729 people died. This is really in significant part, not only, and Kashish talked through a number of the different legal mechanisms that folks have used, but this has been very significantly because of the rollout of vaccines in the United States. And that has, we should just acknowledge, a bunch of legal and policy responses behind it that's actually made it work. So what has worked, right? So one, funding has been remarkable, right? Countries have been able to use flexibility to be able to move money, to be able to rapidly fund science in the US and the EU. And legislatures have played a key role in this because they've been the ones either moving funds or making it possible through appropriations in the United States or through budget bills in various countries. And that's required a lot of rapid coordination and the flexible use of funds between legislative and executive branches that's just been quite remarkable. And so we have, for example, the Moderna vaccine, right? Because of $2.7 billion of investment from the United States government. And it's worth noting $1 million from Dolly Parton. And that kind of public-private partnership has been very real, right? Because the way that vaccine was developed was that NIH scientists were key in developing a key part of that vaccine. And then they worked with the private sector, with Moderna, to be able to put together the technologies to be able to deliver a vaccine in under a year. So that's been remarkable. The other one that's worth mentioning that's working is really the regulatory pathways, right? They've been innovative. We have seen the largest utilization of emergency use. So look, the kind of other pieces that I was just saying, and it was that the regulatory pathways have been really impressive, right? The FDA, the European Medicines Agency, the South African Health Products Authority, those have been really efficient, and they've kept standards high because we haven't seen submission of low quality efforts. But it's worth noting, right, that on a global level, the mechanisms are really failing, right? So the US is now moving to implement, vaccination for everybody under 16, making everybody eligible. And yet, while the US is vaccinating healthy people, most low-income countries and middle-income countries are not even vaccinating all of their health workers. They're not even vaccinating their elderly yet. And so this is deeply unjust, and it's going to perpetuate the continuation not only of high mortality rates, but of the pandemic to come. We can look at India, we can look at Brazil, we can look at Malawi, where a month ago, hospitals were completely full and people were dying outside those hospitals. And the core reason for this is that countries have been unable to purchase vaccines, right? So the global architecture that was created to address this, the primary mechanism has been COVAX, right? The advanced purchase mechanism that was set up by WHO and Gavi and others to purchase for 92 low and middle income countries. The problem is that there was not a global legal agreement on procurement or production. So the result, rich countries bought all the supplies, right? The US, for example, would thankfully not have probably allowed states within the United States to bid against each other and to buy directly from producers, so that we ended up vaccinating 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds who were healthy in New Hampshire while healthcare workers died in Michigan. That would be an unacceptable response. But that's exactly what's happening internationally because there's no such legal structure in place. Companies, therefore, are the ones that are actually making the contracts based on their own considerations in this broadly unregulated space. And therefore, companies are able to prioritize for themselves which countries they want to sell to. COVAX's goal was to get 20% of low and middle income country folks covered this year. That they are off to a very slow start. That was already a low goal to begin with. And meanwhile, there's this kind of monopoly over production, where only a handful of companies are able to produce. And that's because of intellectual property. It's also because of trade secrets. And it's also because of just knowledge that exists within these companies that has not been sold. There's been a series of proposals about what to do about that, but they've largely been ignored. And so the result is right now, we've got fantastic science, but only 0.2% so far of vaccination have gone into arms in low-income countries. the vast majority, over 87%, have gone into high income countries. And so that's where we're at. And it's going to perpetuate the pandemic for all of us.
Wow. So given that situation, given how you describe the issues of access and equity, are there alternative legal means that are available both at the national, and also at the international level to address this situation?
There are, and this is the kind of both good news and the really painful news, I think, right? We have not, as a globe, taken on board a lot of the experiences from the last 30 years, right? And I think in part about the AIDS response, where millions of folks died between the time that antiretrovirals that were effective to fight AIDS were discovered and when they rolled out in low and middle income countries. And so what we've learned from that, we should rapidly take on board. One, governments can create regulatory pathways and executive actions that actually do expand the supply and availability. Right now, the crisis is supply of vaccines. It's not that people don't want to take them in low and middle income countries. It's not that governments don't want to buy them. It's not even right now that there's not enough money to buy them internationally. It's that we don't have supply because only a handful of companies are currently able to make them, which is particularly damaging given that these are publicly funded entities, right? Or agents that we're talking about. These vaccines are across the board highly supported by public funds. And so there's a clear concern too, right, that the companies intend to raise the price, which economists like Nobel Prize winner Joe Stiglitz will tell you is what happens in a monopoly, right? So there's a bunch of pieces that kind of governments have legal tools at their disposal that are legal within the international trading regime under the World Trade Organization rules, and that are legal within most nations' national laws. One is compulsory licensing, right? Patents, of course, are government-created monopolies. Governments have the right to think about how those patents and those monopolies are used. They can order companies to allow the production of a set of patented goods, and these are used all the time around the world, right? So in HIV, it was used hundreds of times to import or produce HIV drugs. The United States has used this to tackle flu, to tackle a variety of other health issues, and is used all the time to tackle all sorts of technical aspects out there that are unrelated. So compulsory licensing is one option. The problem is it takes years and months, right? So most of the time, these are not kind of fast regulatory pieces that just drop like this. They take quite a long time. They have certainly been used. Israel has been using, for example, a compulsory license to import a generic drug to fight COVID. Unfortunately, that drug turned out not to be effective, right? And so that's been one challenge. But the other challenge is what we really need right now is we need global coordinated production, right? Where countries, it's not just that you produce each of the vaccines in your country and therefore you're kind of doing that. Instead, what you need is we need to set up regional hubs to produce these vaccines. And to do that, to be able to do that, we need kind of two things. One, we need a kind of long-term sustainable agreement, at least for the duration of the pandemic, where countries are able to buy, purchase, and produce across borders. And there is a regulatory, pathway for that within the World Trade Organization. It has largely been completely ineffective, right? It has not allowed, because each country needs to issue their own compulsory license. It's on a single product, et cetera, et cetera. What we need is kind of two things. One, kind of India and South Africa have proposed a kind of global agreement to suspend temporarily the enforcement of the TRIPS agreement at the global level, which would mean that companies would have the incentive to go ahead and stand up that factory, because that during the pandemic, if you're in India, you're in South Africa, you're in Thailand, you're in Vietnam, you're a producer of goods, it's fine for you to go ahead and invest the time and energy to start making this vaccine because it's not going to be patented tomorrow, right?
And can you remind us, Matt, what a TRIPS waiver is? Well, backing up, what is TRIPS for people who might not know?
Absolutely, right? So within the World Trade Organization rules, the TRIPS agreement is the intellectual property agreement that requires all countries around the world to have patents, and not just to have patents, but to have 20-year patents and to have them on drugs. It used to be in many years, before 2005, many countries did not allow for the patenting of medicines, right? And that changed under TRIPS. But in the AIDS response, one of the things we saw was a Doha declaration that said, look, that is not all powerful. There don't have to be patents that last forever for everything. There's a variety of flexibilities that countries have within the World Trade Organization rules. And these things like compulsory licensing are some of the examples of what they can use. And then just one more thing, just to throw out there, Warren, is just, the piece on IP is one side of it. The other is vaccines are actually harder than some of these small molecules that we talk about them, right? So if you're making an AIDS drug, you can reverse engineer it relatively quickly, but vaccines are far more complicated. So what we really need is we need patent pooling and we need technology transfer. And it's unfortunate because legislatures here missed a key opportunity, right? What they could have done is to say, when we are investing the level of investment that we're making, $2.7 billion into a rapidly emerging technology, that's with that carrot comes a little bit of a stick. And the stick is you have to actually share your technology for use around the world when it's a globally important technology that we're going to need to use to stop a pandemic, right? And so there could have been a whole bunch of provisions that were required of the funding from NIH, from HHS, from other places in the US, as well as the European funding and the UK funding. Governments also could have used things like the Defense Production Act, and they could be using that globally. So there's a key role here to incentivize cooperation so that we could have factories in Africa, Asia, Latin America, all producing these vaccines, so that instead of competing for a single dose from a single producer, does that go into a shot in an arm in the US, or does it go into a shot in India or in Malawi? We can say, actually, let's make it in Africa, let's make it in Asia, let's make that same vaccine around the world.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for those recommendations on the TRIPS waiver, compulsory licensing, technology transfer. But of course, I understand these are hotly debated topics. There's no universal consensus. And so in sort of lawyerly fashion here, I think I'm going to challenge you to switch hats and see if you can make the other argument. I mean, why doesn't everyone agree on this? Why are people arguing against the TRIPS waiver, that sort of thing?
So the core argument on the other side is a really important one, which is we need innovation, right? There has to be a way in which we incentivize companies and we incentivize researchers to go do that work of science, whether it's the basic science research into kind of the molecules that will be able to do it, or the development research. How do you can have a perfectly good molecule and not be able to turn it into a medicine that will actually be effective for people. And so the core idea here is we have to incentivize the private sector to invest to do that. And the way that we incentivize that is what we say, this high risk activity that may or may not give you rewards, with it comes a monopoly for 20 plus years, right? Where you get to actually be the only producer of that if the innovation works. And the idea is that that's going to incentivize innovation. And it has to some degree, right? There's clear innovation that's been happening. But in recent years, we've noticed two things. One, we've noticed that innovation per dollar spent is actually really declining, right? That's actually a crisis that's recognized across the industry. And there's a wide variety of, we could do a whole nother webinar on that and what the challenges are. But the other thing is we've seen a lot of Me Too drugs, right? There are a whole bunch of drugs for a whole bunch of statins where companies are incentivized to make a very similar drug, et cetera. And so rather than fully innovation, especially for the big picture questions like tuberculosis, we've had one new drug in decades, right? And so it's not incentivizing the kind of innovation that works for poor folks. And the other thing that doesn't work very well for is for emergency movement, right? And so COVID-19 is really interesting because we see an alternative to this. We have seen the most remarkable innovation, I would argue, almost in my lifetime on this, right? We've seen, building off of NIH science, a partnership between public and private sectors that has worked brilliantly. It has brought within a year multiple effective vaccines to the fore, but that's largely been through public investments. And this is where we need to think about multiple different potential ways to understand drug development. Developing a vaccine in the middle of a pandemic is different than developing a drug for male pattern baldness, which, I would like better ones of, I'll just say. But these are not the same.
Can we declare that a public health emergency? I don't think so.
We might be able to, but I think maybe these are not the same kind of need, right? And so we really could think about these things differently. Right now, we're in the worst of all worlds, I would argue, because the regulatory pathways are all about maintaining a monopoly, either a default monopoly or a patented monopoly. And the reality is that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so these two things are colliding, and we don't have a good way forward right now for how do we push that. But interestingly, governments have a lot of kind of carrots and sticks, right? So you talked about some of them before, but there's a new report out just today, right? And just today, it turns out that the United States owns the patent that Moderna is actually using would have to have, and which has not been licensed to Moderna, to make its vaccine. That same patent is probably necessary to make the J&J vaccine, to make the Pfizer vaccine. Turns out that all of these are actually infringing in IP on the US government's patents that they hold. So how about the US government kind of uses those regulatory powers, right? Uses that leverage and says, hey, everybody, yes, you can keep on selling in the United States, but around the world, if you want to use our patent, the exchange for that is that you have to actually make it available for production in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. Those are real possibilities. We've seen the kind of incentivization that we want for drugs in COVID-19. It's just not come through a patent structure. It's come through direct investment. And so we can treat those things differently.
Yeah. Well, before we leave this topic, one more question, just for a minute or two. I noticed you did not include among your alternatives, you did not mention voluntary licensing agreements. I know those were used, for instance, with remdesivir and in other contexts. How does that fit in? Are those working in the COVID context?
It's really key, and I'm glad you asked that question. The voluntary licensing that's happened, and we've seen this over years in HIV, et cetera, has been really important. You know, it's worth noting, for example, that the most recent HIV drug, that was one of the most recent, dolutegravir, it was introduced by this company, ViiV. It came to market almost simultaneously in the United States and around the world. In the United States, it came through ViiV. Around the world, it came through 5 Indian generic companies because the companies agreed that they could be manufacturing, and they offered voluntary licensing, right? The key to it is that voluntary licenses to work have to have multiple producers, and they have to allow the companies to set the price and their distribution strategy, right? So for example, there's been a voluntary license between AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute of India, but it's an exclusive license. So what it results in is it doesn't result in competition. It doesn't result in, kind of the kind of ecosystem that we would want. Instead, what it results in is the Serum Institute of India is the other producer. It's basically just making it on contract for AstraZeneca. So AstraZeneca still holds that monopoly. And what we've seen recently, right, is that the government of India has actually followed the EU example where they've put export restrictions on those vaccines. India has now done the same thing. They're putting export restrictions on the vaccine. And the result is that the vaccine is not moving out to the rest of the world. It's instead being used in India, which you have to understand the government's position, which is we have a massive crisis. If it's being produced by one producer in the world for the whole developing world, we're not going to be able to see competition. So of course they need to hold on to that drug, just like the EU has said. What we need instead, if there were 10 companies that were all making that drug, if there was one in Venezuela, if there was one in Vietnam where there's a company that could do it, in Thailand, there's a company that can do it, in Senegal, we'd see multiple different productions. Governments, though, have to be the ones that incentivize those voluntary actions. We have seen over and over again, companies don't just decide to wake up tomorrow and do it. Actually, almost always it's because governments threaten a compulsory license or use a compulsory license using that power of government.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So let me switch. I'm going to switch here from you to Michele. And in part that's because I want to keep focused on the fact that, of course, we have many pressing health issues around the world that have existed even before the pandemic and will afterwards. So we don't want to lose the forest for the trees here. So with Michele, I'm hoping to step back for a minute, and I would like to ask whether you could give us a bird's eye view on the system, the global system for researching, developing, and distributing medical products.
Yes, hi, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. And thanks to Penn Law and to the Allegis team for putting this together. Glad to be here, and good to hear Matt and Kashish this morning already. That's a big question. How do I do that in 5 minutes or less? But what I want to start out by saying is that there are 3 different categories or buckets, I'd like to say, of drugs. One are the drugs that we use for what we call routine care. Another bucket is for the drugs that are designed or called for public health purposes, such as a malaria drug, a drug that is used to treat a disease that affects a large swath of a population. And so for public health purposes, we would use it. And third, something we would use in a pandemic, such as the COVID vaccine that we're all worried about right now. So when we think about the R&D ecosystem, I want to say it's not really a global system. It's very national at the moment. And this R&D work is done by private companies, both small, medium, and large. We have to remember that a lot of the companies involved in the innovation that we benefit from are small, little emerging companies. They're not the Pfizers of the world. It's also done by universities and by state-operated enterprises. And some of the vaccines we have today are actually produced by those. But there are lots and lots of things that have to be in place for a company, an entity of any sort, to do the research and development to create a drug. So, for example, they need to have a good workforce. They need to have an educational system that educates those people to be able to do the bench science and other work that has to be done. We need a laboratory system. We need good rule of law in place. We have to have the ability to enforce contracts. We need an enabling environment. And by that, it can be as simple as having enough power to turn the lights on every day. And importantly, we need to have financial supports for that kind of work. And that comes, as Matt has mentioned, in the form of government funding, grants. It comes in the form of internal resources, as well as from the capital markets. Moderna, for example, went to the capital markets to get some of its initial funding because it kept knocking on doors and not getting anywhere. And it also has to have a market for those planned products. There has to be a reason to justify the risk taken in terms of investment of financial and human resources, and for the forbearance of engaging in other activities. Now, there are many more elements that I haven't got time to mention, but I provided two graphics, one of which comes from, one is this one here, and it comes from a report called Promoting Access to Medical Technologies and Innovation. And there are 13 different elements for innovation for medical technologies. And when we say medical technologies, we mean all of those drugs, the devices, the ventilators, the things that are used to treat patients when they're ill. And of these 13 elements, patents are just one. The other graphic that I've given you comes from a report called Developing and Distributing COVID Vaccines Around the World. And it shows everything from vaccine development, domestic approval, manufacture, international distribution, border clearance, and then the distribution side of it, which is getting those jabs in the arms. I'm not going to have time to go through them all, but the point is that there are many, many elements and steps along the way to get something developed and then to get it distributed around the world. So I leave those for you to have a look at in your free time. Now, it's interesting that as of September 2020, there were 321 candidates for vaccines. And as of April 2021, we have about 10 or so. I lose track some days. So we have the Pfizer, the Moderna, the AstraZeneca, Oxford vaccines. We have the J&J. We have 2 out of China, 1 out of Russia, and some coming out of Cuba. And Novavax is another one. And all of these vaccines that moved from that big world of 321 candidates down to about 10 of them went through all of the science that Matt talked about. And also they were supported through both a combination of advanced purchase agreements and other sources of funding, some philanthropic, such as Wellcome Trust that went to the AstraZeneca. But the bottom line is that that funding de-risked the process. And the de-risking process is extremely important to the overall system, because if there's no market for a product, there's no business opportunity to make it. And if you don't have a business opportunity to make it with a revenue source to support the work, you have to have a philanthropic source of funding or a government source of funding in order to pay for the development and then the production and the distribution of the product. And we don't really have a system, as Matt mentioned, where we have figured out how to organize and orchestrate across the 3 buckets that I talked about: routine, pandemic, and what I'll call public health products. We don't have a good system for that yet. Now, adding to the de-risking that came from the funding for the COVID vaccines that we have now, was something else that happened during the pandemic, which doesn't usually happen. One is we had collaboration across the system that was extraordinary, including novel clinical trial designs. We also had a sharing of information that occurred and a relief from the usual constraints that limit the ability of companies to work together towards a common goal, and such as anti-competition rules were waived. so that companies could actually work together. Now, it's quite true that we didn't necessarily apply to those funding arrangements the kind of access provisions that would have enabled the goal that people seem to want to accomplish at this point, which is the distribution across the world. And I think it's a matter of how countries as a whole are guided and directed and agreed and committed to making that kind of an arrangement possible. And we don't have that. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a couple of minutes. In addition, so that's the development side, but then we have the distribution side, and that's where countries, most of whom around the world are importers. They're not producers. It certainly is the case that every country could become a research and development location, but that's not what we have right now. So you have a handful, to some extent, of countries that do R&D, and most other countries import products. But there's a role for them to play. They're really on the pull side of the system. They ought to be naming what it is that they want, and they do through their procurement systems, through their selection systems, through their registration systems in place. So if anything, we could say that we have a system that's sort of functioning. It has two major parts to it. There's work to be done to improve them, and many countries around the world are engaging in the kind of reviews that are necessary to get to a better place of pulling rather than just receiving and reacting. There's a mismatch in general, I think we have to say, between what is being developed and what is needed and the cost of those products. Some call this a market failure. I don't really like the term market failure. I would rather say that there's a misalignment because the incentives for innovation are not in a clear alignment with what the healthcare systems needs. Now, when we use this word incentives, many often people are referring to the IP system, where you make it, you get a patent on it, you have a protection for a period of time. But there are more facilities also that are necessary for that innovation system to work, like financing in particular. It's very important that we really consider the financing side of this, and rule of law is extremely important. And again, we have to align those facilities and those innovation incentives across the three buckets: the day-to-day routine products that we need, products for public health purposes, such as antimicrobials. We're having a shortage of antimicrobials in the world right now. So we have a rate of drug-resistant infections that are going on. And one of the reasons we have a shortage of antimicrobials is because we had a misalignment between the incentives and facilities for the production of those products and the need. And we are addressing that with some very interesting developments. And finally, we need a similar arrangement for pandemic products. Now, countries like Ghana and Thailand have taken the step towards a comprehensive look at that surround sound system that's necessary to be in place to address their needs. And I applaud them to do that. And so I think my next question that Warren is going to ask me is, where do we go from here? Am I right, Warren?
Well, you've predicted the future, Michele. I mean, because what you've done essentially is give us super concise tour de force summary of the system as it exists now. So yeah, what's next?
Well, I think that I've just said that we have to, look at this alignment problem, and it really boils down to governance, both at the national level and at the global level. And there are bright spots on the horizon, and we're going to talk about some of those as well today. We've mentioned COVAX, we've mentioned the ACT Accelerator, we've mentioned other things that are underway, and we'll talk more about those. For the past 2 weeks, I've been attending the WHO Fair Price Forum, which is a biannual event where many good ideas, examples, and observations about the challenges have been discussed. Now, this event, interestingly, has been attended by government representatives, WHO folks, of course, academics, activists, public-private partnership directors, and other UN multilateral agencies. But few, if any, people have come from the industry to that event, which brings me to the first of my 8 points of where we go from here. So given all the factors, these images that I've given you, all of those factors and more that I don't have time to mention today, we really need an all in the room approach. We need everybody at the table, and we need a wider circle of inquiry. And to this, I'm gonna go back to both Ghana and Thailand, because what they did is they got into the room folks from universal health coverage or health finance. They got the trade people in the room. They got the customs people in the room. They got industry in the room. They got the medicines regulators in the room, the healthcare folks in the room. Everybody across the board, and civil society were importantly in the room, so that they could look around that whole system and figure out what they needed to tweak in order to align their incentives and their facilities with their public health goals. Because this is an alignment that has to happen both at the national level and it has to happen at the global level. And again, we have to consider those different buckets, because the needs and the approaches that have to be taken for each of those buckets are different. They are not the same. Secondly, we need to have better information. This is a big role for the WHO, which already plays this role to some extent, for example, with its priority pathogen work and its monitoring along the pipeline report. States have to do the same. And that way we can pool and share this information about what countries need. And of course, there's a category for what we need for pandemics and what we have to do to get there. But it's also because the pandemic situation we're in is really reflective of what is true about medicines access in general. We have gross misalignments, and we're not getting to the point where people have access to the available products that they need when they need them. With this basic information, this data, we can then do our basic and translational research so that we can preposition the enabling science. Third, we need the funding for at-risk production. Now, this is for pandemics particularly, and really also for some other kinds of products that we need. We need the manufacturing infrastructure in place so that that infrastructure can also be at risk, because we can't be in a position where we ask a manufacturer to make a product and then never buy it from them because we don't need it at the end of the day. That doesn't work. Fourth, we need a better definition for access to medicines. And this definition needs to be harmonized across funders. For example, if the Wellcome Trust, which was a funder of the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, defines access differently than what the UK, which was also a funder, and the EU Commission defines it at, there's a problem, because at the end of the day, their commercialization rollout will not be consistent across all countries, and perhaps be inconsistent with their funder definition. Now, there is already some work underway in the form of the MAP guide, which is collecting access provisions so that we can move to a place of more harmonization of those definitions. But at the end of the day, funders need to be better stewards of access. Similarly, public funders and governments in general overall need to be more effective stewards of innovation and therefore access. Government must agree now this is at the global level and again at the national level, how we're going to define our targets, what we're going to fund. So if the European Union and the United States think differently about what we need to target for our funding, we miss out on the opportunity to coordinate our funding in a way that accomplishes global goals and national goals for those three buckets: routine, pandemic, and public health needs. We also need to have in place a better global mechanism, and this is going to come up in the discussion around the pandemic treaty, mechanisms to organize and orchestrate all of these things. We need to have funding. That's the seventh point I want to make, and I think I've made it already. And finally, as Thailand said during the Fair Pricing Forum, no one instrument does it all. We have some hard work ahead of us. It's not as easy as just waiving IP. That is not going to do the job entirely by itself. There's much more work to do across a lot of fronts, and I look forward to that work.
Oh, thank you, Michele. So let me squeeze in one more question before we turn to Q&A. I would like to return more specifically to the pandemic here, I know that Kashish talked about how nations can better prepare for pandemic preparedness, response, recovery. I'm wondering if you could address the same topic, but from the perspective of multilateral organizations, for instance, the World Health Organization.
Yes, thank you for that question. There's a lot underway, and I think this upcoming World Health Assembly in May is going to be a rock and roll experience with a lot to be done on this very question. There is on the table a proposal for a pandemic treaty, and that has been proposed by President Charles Michele of the European Union, supported as well by DG Tedros of the WHO. Within the treaty idea, there are four main elements. One is to build resilience. I'm just going to read you the four. Build resilience to the pandemics and other global health emergencies with robust national and global preparedness systems. Yes, sure, we really do need that. Second, because we've had an inconsistent approach to how we deal with this pandemic. We need to ensure timely and equitable access to pandemic countermeasures. And in this regard, we really need to address the question of a mechanism to procure and distribute products and manufacturing infrastructure. Third, we need to support sustainable funding and capacity for prevention, detection, and responses to outbreaks, both at the global and the national level. And fourth, we need to promote mutual trust. Now, these are big categories and a lot of details are going to come within them, and we don't exactly know yet, but this is on the table, and I think it will have traction on a number of areas. Whether the WHO is the right place for this treaty is an interesting question. I pose to those of you who ponder questions of international law. This might well actually work at the UN General Assembly better, because no pandemic is just going to be dealt with within the health sector. The economic sectors are involved, many other sectors are involved. There have also been, as mentioned, the CTAP activity, the COVAX activity, and initiatives to create manufacturing matches. Those kinds of things are underway. We'll also see a discussion around the revision of the international health regulations, whether that's subsumed under the pandemic treaty or remains as a standalone. I'm not sure yet. We'll see how that rolls out. And there could be opportunity within that treaty revision to address some of the issues we've talked about today. At the World Trade Organization, there are meetings underway to consider a manufacturing convention. There have been a number of meetings in the last 2 weeks or so on manufacturing issues to try and build relationships between the producers and the other potential manufacturers. The Ottawa Group on Trade and Health, which will address this whole question of strengthening the global supply chain and facilitating trade in essential medicines to avoid those export curbs that India is considering right now. That will come up during the next WTO ministerial. I think it's in November. The TRIPS Council proposal we've talked about already. And also other UN organizations like UNIDO, the UN Industrial Development Organization, are supporting local manufacturing in Africa. This has been a long-standing initiative on the part of UNIDO. It is part of the African Union overall plan to increase local production of all medicines within Africa. UN OPS, the procurement entity of the UN, is supporting better procurement. It's doing a lot of work in Mexico and other countries right now. This is a very important element for medicines overall. The G20 has an independent high-level independent panel on financing the global commons for pandemic preparedness. And this is a step in the direction of finding the kind of flexible and sustainable and at the ready financing that we need down the road and now for sure. And finally, the Global Pandemic Monitoring Board has written a report, and I would urge anybody who's interested to have a look at it. It's called The World in Disaster. Kind of a frightening story, actually. And it makes another point, and that is that current measures of preparedness are not predictive of the effectiveness of country response. We've had a lot of measures on such as IHR assessments that determine whether one has complied with the IHR obligations. But what we're becoming clear about is that that doesn't necessarily say that if you're complying with IHR, that you're able to respond to a pandemic. So I think we're going to also see some further analysis there. Those are just some of the many things that are underway. And
lots going on. Wow. Well, could we, I think it might be appropriate now to turn to Q&A if we could, with all panelists with their video on. We have lots of good questions coming in. Here's the first one, just to get us, I invite this to be a conversational format, so panelists should feel free to jump in. But here's the first question to get us started from the audience. Based on, this is for Kashish specifically, based on your experience practicing in India, what are the legal means that the government can employ in India to scale up the production of the COVID-19 vaccines? What are its global implications?
Thanks, Warren, and that's a great question. So India plays a very crucial role in global vaccinations. And before I get straight to your question, I think I'll give a quick background of what production in India means for the world. So India, which is also commonly known as the pharmacy of the world, is host to the Serum Institute of India, which is manufacturing the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, and is the major supplier to many middle and low-income countries and a major contributor to COVAX. India also has its own indigenous vaccine, Bharat Biotech Covaxin. So somewhere to the end of March, of the 316 million vaccines produced in India, 65 million doses have been exported. Of these, more than 10 million was sent as grants, almost 26 million as on a commercial basis, and about 19 million under the COVAX program. So now, as all of you are aware, the second wave of the pandemic has hit India with greater ferocity, and despite a year to prepare, we have been caught off guard again. Multiple reports of the scarcity of vaccine and drugs have surfaced from different parts of the country. And there are also reports of export restrictions, which is clearly concerning for the entire world. Serum Institute of India has also delayed its COVAX commitment. Now, in the last 72 hours, there's been an interesting development in India. So from the 1st of May, anyone above 18 years would be eligible for the vaccine in the country. This, coupled with a possible need for a booster shot in the future, and export obligations all this simply increases the demand substantially, and while there's a substantial supply deficit. So while I get to the legal means that India has, there's another thing to keep in mind here, that these are not just ordinary times, and we should not look at IP issues dissecting them from the extraordinary times we are living in. Today, we should look at the access issue from the lens of a pandemic, keeping in mind that thousands are dying across the world while we are speaking here. I'd like to talk about two legal means that the government could have employed last year itself and should employ at the earliest now to scale up the production of the COVAX vaccine. And there are two issues and other solutions over here. One's the non-IP-based solution, and then there's an IP-based solution. As far as the non-IP-based solution, as I mentioned, India has an Epidemic Disease Act, which is quite vague and broad. But here, taking advantage of the vagueness, the government, during the outbreak of the epidemic, can take measures that it may deem necessary to prevent the outbreak or its spread. That's pretty broad. Second, the Drugs and Cosmetic Act empowers the central government to regulate the scale, manufacture, and distribute of drug that is essential to meet the requirements of an emergency arising due to an epidemic. So, under the garb of these two provisions, the government can direct pharmaceutical companies to loan their manufacturing capacities to the existing COVID-19 manufacturers, like the Serum Institute of India and Bharat Biotech, to boost their manufacturing capabilities so that more COVID-19 vials can be produced. And obviously, this will involve tech transfer. The next is the IP-based solution, to which I think Matt and Michele have addressed to some extent. The first one is that our Patent Act allows the central government to authorize anyone, that is any pharmaceutical company, to use any patents or patent applications for government use. Second, we also have a compulsory licensing provision under which the central government can issue a compulsory license in circumstances of national emergency or extreme urgency. And I think we all can agree that this pandemic is a circumstance of national emergency. Another option available is that, which have already been discussed to an extent, is that COVID-19 vaccine projects that are funded by taxpayer money should either not claim IP rights in the first place, or if patents are granted, they should not be enforced. And I speak this specifically in the context of Covaxin that has been developed by Bharat Biotech in collaboration with the Indian Council of Medical Research, which is basically the Ministry of Health. So the government needs to explore the production capabilities of the pharmaceutical companies in both the public as well as private sector. Now, we have had some interesting, good, positive news in the last 1 week, which I'm not sure if our audience is aware of. So last week, the government made a decision to fund 3 state-run facilities in India to make Bharat Biotech vaccines, and the tech transfer process has commenced. This is amazing. This decision may result in increasing the production of indigenously developed Covaxin vaccine by nearly 6 to 7-fold by August 2020, and it's expected that by the end of this year, the entire production will increase 10-fold. But it will take another 5 to 10 months for these 3 facilities to produce the vaccines and get them to the market. But once internal production increases, as a consequence, India will be able to export much more. But had these licenses been issued by the government last year itself, we would have had higher supplies of COVID-19 vaccines today itself, and there would not have been any contemplation on export restrictions. And this legal option had been available to the government all along. Even now, today, as we speak, the government needs to explore the private sector capabilities to enhance production. Again, I think it's important to look at the entire issue from the present day context. Thank you.
Thank you, Kashish. Let me jump to another great question from the audience for anyone who wants to respond to it. Essentially, it's about federalism and how federalism may have complicated COVID response in some countries. And are there any examples of countries where the federalist system has been made to respond effectively to COVID? Any takers there?
Germany is a federal system, and Angela Merkel sat all the, I don't know what they're called, the governors of the states down and came up with a plan for a more coordinated approach. That didn't happen in the United States, although certainly the Governors Association could have done it. And there were some regional approaches within the United States to it. In other countries, there have really been, like in Australia, for example, there have been inconsistent approaches to how to handle the situation. So you might have one provision in one state, but not in another. So federalism has been a barrier, has been a problem. That's about all I can say on it.
Okay.
I'll just add to it from the perspective of India, which is again a federal government. It's interesting how the response has changed over the past 1 year, specifically in the context of the first wave and the second wave. So, although as per our constitution, health is a state subject, during the first wave response that goes way back in March, somehow the government, with the help of the Disaster Management Act, was capable enough to take a central control. And for the initial few months, the entire pandemic response went through executive orders coming from the center. Now, as we're looking at it during the second wave of response, the central government is actually quiet, and there's more state government response kicking in. So India might be a good case study once all of this gets over, to see that which response went how and why, because we've seen in a government, in a country, seeing both different levels of the entire system taking place in different waves of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. We have another question on an issue that is getting to be potentially politically controversial, about a person from the audience is curious to hear your views on what you think about the key rule of law issues with respect to vaccine e-certificates and passports. Who would like to answer that one? Kashish? Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay, so just quickly, first of all, vaccine passports are nothing new. It's been happening since ages. But what's new are digital vaccine passports. So as far as few legal issues are concerned, and I'll just list them. First of them are equity concerns. Remember that the vaccination program is not going on the same all over the world. There are several issues that's going on. So if you impose a requirement for a vaccine passport, it may discriminate for particular travelers from a particular country. Second is an issue of rights. few countries and few individuals consider right to travel an important right. The third are privacy issues which are arising with the use of technology in the entire vaccination process. India, for example, is actually contemplating on using artificial intelligence for vaccination and vaccine passports. That's concerning. And finally, from international, from an IHR perspective, vaccine passports may pose a violation under Article 43 of IHR because IHR requires you to impose least restrictive measures. So we might want to weigh in if the 14-day quarantine versus the vaccine passport, which one looks better and why? And then another requirement in the IHR is that any measure should be either have scientific backing or the WHO should be supporting them there. Whereas right now with vaccine passports, both these elements see some sort of controversy. So those are the quick legal issues I have in mind.
Okay.
And I think just to come in briefly, I mean, I think one other thing just to keep in mind from a kind of broadly ethical conversation is right now, when we think about international vaccine passports, i.e. differently from kind of domestically used e-passports in various ways that are called in that way, we've got a really big ethical issue, which is when most of the world is unable to get access to vaccines, in large part because of a set of behaviors, frankly, from rich countries, right, that have bought all of the vaccine doses. It's deeply unethical to then impose travel restrictions on people that are unable to get access to vaccines. And so as we think about kind of human rights paradigms within international law and within international health conversations, we often think about these questions of equity, about what kinds of duties do countries have to each other, and the economic damage from not allowing people to travel and to only allow those people to travel compounds upon the health damage that's coming. So if we saw a situation where the only people that were allowed to go to the highest income countries in the world are those people already vaccinated, but those who are in low and middle income countries cannot get vaccinated, the catch-22 of the economic damage that secondarily imposes is very, very substantial, which is why the WHO, the WTO, and others have all said that the kind of vaccine passports at this stage don't make sense. But that might change if we can move toward a situation of vaccine equity, in which case we're having a conversation that's a very different one than we are today.
Here's a great question about mechanisms for de-risking are very pertinent because manufacturers are demanding from governments substantial indemnification from third-party liability in exchange for providing their products. Essentially, these place governments in a take it or leave it situation when procuring vaccines and assume substantial litigation risk in order to obtain vitally needed vaccines. Would any of you want to address that situation?
No, this is a major problem, right? So, and just to be clear about what the conversation is, that each of the major vaccine manufacturers are now having conversations bilaterally that are confidential and secret negotiations by design, that are challenging. And those conversations with governments include what are the conditions under which the company would agree to sell doses to that country, right? And so in South Africa, for example, there's been a recent kind of blow up around a number of the provisions that included things like putting sovereign assets up as collateral for the potential that there might be lawsuits against vaccine manufacturers for vaccine manufacturer negligence, right? In the US, of course, we have a no-fault system that's in place. It's been in place for a long time around vaccines. Many countries don't have a similar structure. And so there's a conversation around what is the right way to think about compensation and other pieces. But there are really important kind of considerations here. And those are twofold. One, right now we are in a situation of a small set of monopolies over production. And I'll just say that I think, Michele had kind of said, that this is not just about a waiver. And I think actually it's a straw man. Nobody actually is arguing that the only issue is a waiver. But what's really clear is the current situation of a handful of monopolies over the production of vaccines is resulting in a very distorted process, right? In which companies have disproportionate power over governments in ways that are resulting in them being able to make demands that in other contexts wouldn't be able to happen because, as Kashish was saying, we're in a pandemic, right? We're not in normal times. We're in the middle of a pandemic. And that means everything is on the table. Governments are putting money up. Governments are putting all sorts of things up to try to end this pandemic. And the reality is here, right, that what we're actually talking about is that companies like Moderna, like Pfizer, bought up factories. One bought an old Polaroid factory, right? Another, that'd never been used before. Nobody had ever used made an mRNA vaccine before, retrofit it, and now they're making millions of doses in 3 to 6 months. So what we're actually talking about is, should we actually set up factories in Africa, Asia, Latin America to make those kinds of vaccines? And then what would it take, right? And I'll just say that I think one of the things that we sometimes go down a bizarre road of thinking about things in terms of, oh no, countries don't have the capacity to do this, right? India, South Africa, Senegal, Vietnam, Thailand, all of these are countries with huge human capacity and technical capacity to make vaccines. That within 6 months, these are countries where companies could be and have asked to stand up the production of these vaccines. The barrier is they need two things. One, they need security that the IP that won't come in later, right? That there's not going to be a move shortly to say, oh, now we will actually patent this drug or this vaccine, and therefore you can't use it. And then two, they need tech transfer, because these vaccines are complicated to make. They require a whole bunch of delicate conversations around how do you actually secure enough supplies, et cetera. But the barrier here is not technical know-how, and the barrier here is not human resources and capacity. The barrier here is the kind of knowledge transfer that was supposed to be part and parcel of global health writ large. And so I think that's where the really tragic moment we're in right now is that the CTAP that Michele mentioned, right, which was the COVID Technology Access Pool, was meant to do exactly this, where countries and companies could share technology. We could think broadly about what the ethical ways are to incentivize, to pay companies their due for the work that they've put in, but also make sure that we actually prioritize access where patents would be shared and know-how would be shared across countries. Not a single company has put their know-how into that pool, right? Not a single country has actually joined it that has access to that technology. And so that's a failed mechanism right now because countries are refused to actually participate in it. And instead they keep pointing to COVAX, which is failing to actually do anything approaching the ability to actually stop the pandemic using the vaccines. But we have alternatives, right? And this is where governments have to act, right? Legislatures and executives have a whole bunch of these levers that we've talked about that they could put in place to incentivize countries and to push companies into sharing these technologies. That's really on the table coming forward.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Let me see if I can squeeze in one more question, even though we have a few more minutes. I think this one is for Michele. Maybe if you could try this in 2 minutes. Do we really need a treaty? Can we not do this through the international health regulations? I think the concern seems to be that some member states would resist ratification of a separate treaty. How would you reply to that?
It's a good question and an important one. We're going to have to do some parsing at the Assembly in May over what could go into a treaty, a pandemic treaty, versus what could be done with the IHR. The IHR are really about the public health capacities or core capacities that a country must have in place in order to be able to identify a circumstance that suggests that there's an emerging disease that could be of international concern. They have to be able to do that at the national level and say there's something going on in our own country for us to worry about first, which is not always available. And then to be able to take that information and say, okay, does this have international concern, and send that information up to WHO. That's kind of the main function of the IHR. And there's lots of other provisions in it. And so I think there are some challenges with the current status of the IHR right now. Mostly it came out with whether or not countries were actually informing the WHO about something happening, and that was around the Wuhan situation, and in a timely manner, and so that actions could be taken to then address the potential for a pandemic. So there's some tweaking that can happen there, but I don't think the IHR as a structure is adequate for all the other issues that we need to deal with, particularly the global mechanisms, the global coordination of staging of materials, just moving ventilators around the world, masks, PPE, and the whole idea about being ready to produce another drug or vaccine in the event we have another pandemic pathogen out there. And all of the things, the pieces that have to go into that whole process, the financing of it, don't necessarily fall within the IHR. Whether all of those other activities are appropriate for a WHO treaty is another question entirely. I'm not sure it is, because I just don't know that that forum is wide enough and broad enough. Remember, I believe we need all hands on deck. We need all across the spectrum of government agencies, both domestic and international and global, to figure out where we're going to position these different activities that are necessary for us to be prepared for the next pandemic and then to respond to it. And it's going to be a massive undertaking. And I just don't know that the assembly itself is the place where we can take care of all of the pieces. Certainly some of the pieces need to be taken care of there, but not all of them.
Okay, well, thank you. Although we have a bunch of other really, really great questions I would love to get to, I don't think we can. It seems like we're almost out of time here. So I think it's probably time to close it down to make sure that we can end on time. And so I would like to say thank you, obviously, to our panelists. It's been a real pleasure. I think this has been a fabulous conversation. It's been very enlightening for me, and I'm sure for many others. It was so much information. I appreciate too, Michele, the information you put into the chat, which I'll be sure and go back and look at later. I also would like to say thank you to Penn Law, especially the technical wizard behind the scenes today, Neoshi. You don't realize it, but Neoshi has been doing a lot of work to make this go smoothly, and she's done a great job. Yes. And also, of course, thanks to our audience. I mean, people are joining today's webinar from over 20 countries in all sorts of time zones around the world. Some people, I mean, you know, for me, it's morning. For Kashish, it's evening. And for other people, it may be even middle of the night. So thank you very much for joining, and also for your wonderful questions, which made the Q&A so easy. Also, I would like to encourage you all to go to the conference website, www.ilegis.org, and register. Hopefully, we'll see each other either in person or virtually during the conference this October. Thank you, everyone. Have a good morning, good day, good night, wherever you may be.
Thank you, Warren. Thanks to iLegis.
Warren, thank iLegis. Thanks, Penn Law. And Yoshi, where is she? Where is she? Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye, Kashish.
Bye-bye. Thank you.